The lights in the studio buzzed faintly overhead, a soft electric hum that blended into the low voices of producers moving behind the cameras, their signals subtle but urgent. The air was thick with anticipation, not of disaster, but of collision, the kind that reshapes narratives and leaves behind a silence more profound than applause. Jasmine Crockett sat still in her chair, her cobalt blazer sharp against the cool tones of the set, not a wrinkle in sight. She wasn't nervous, she was ready. Precision was her armor. Across from her, Candace Owens crossed her legs, her smile tight and deliberate, eyes scanning like a chess player 2 moves ahead. They were seated on the set of Real America, a late-evening segment known for its confrontational political panels, broadcast out of Phoenix on WJTX. This wasn't a place for nuance. It was a battleground for ideas, sharpened to cut through noise. The panel was full, 4 chairs, 3 voices already known to the audience, and 1 moderator whose job was to appear neutral while navigating landmines. The topic? Race, justice, party lines, common themes repackaged in a way that ensured sparks would fly. Jasmine knew what this was. It wasn't about solutions. It was about theater, about control. And no one played that game better than Candace Owens, until now. The moderator leaned in, his tone rehearsed. Congresswoman Crockett, you've spoken out often about disparities in the justice system. But critics, like Candace here, say the system works, and that race is too often used as a scapegoat. What's your take? Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, deliberate. The problem isn't that race is brought up too often. The problem is that it's ignored until it kills someone. Her words hung in the air, anchored by silence. Candace smiled, but it was performative. She interjected, smooth and rehearsed. With respect, Congresswoman, I think it's dangerous to keep pushing this narrative of victimhood. Not everything bad that happens to Black Americans is because of racism. I'm living proof of that. A few off-camera heads nodded, the usual response. Candace was the exception who erased the rule, a strategy that often disarmed the room. But Jasmine hadn't come to be disarmed. She'd come to be undeniable. She leaned in, gaze steady. So you believe systemic racism is exaggerated? Absolutely, Candace said without hesitation. The numbers don't lie. We have more Black millionaires than ever. Black voices dominate culture, entertainment. We're not hidden, we're celebrated. What we're seeing is victimhood being used as currency. The moderator looked at Jasmine. She didn't speak right away. She waited, just long enough to let the energy in the room tilt. Then, with calm precision, she turned to Candace. That's an interesting position, she said. Because last night, I read a public record that says otherwise. A complaint filed in 2007, I believe, about racial harassment, filed by you. Candace blinked, then laughed softly. Excuse me? I don't know what you're talking about. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She reached into her binder and pulled out a folded paper. Filed with the Stanford Board of Education, she continued. You stated that you were harassed, that you feared for your safety. You didn't just file it. You received a settlement. Am I wrong? Candace opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The moderator leaned forward, visibly tense. Let's keep this respectful, he offered, as if to rebalance the power in the room. Jasmine's voice remained calm. This is respectful. I'm asking how someone who once sought protection from racism can now spend her career telling young Black people that racism isn't real. The shift in the room was seismic. A camera guy adjusted his lens like it might focus truth more clearly. The audience stopped flipping channels. Candace's jaw tightened. That's ancient history, she said finally. I was a kid. It was a different time. But you were telling the truth, weren't you? Jasmine asked, softer now. Yes, Candace replied, almost reflexively. But that's not the point. It is the point, Jasmine said. Because the truth doesn't expire. The silence was longer this time. Candace reached to adjust her microphone, more for distraction than necessity. The moderator tried again to steer. Let's maybe focus on current policy. Jasmine didn't budge. You can't talk about justice if you ignore the past, especially your own. Candace exhaled, sharp and forced. You don't know me. I know your words, Jasmine said. That's enough. Candace raised her voice. People grow. My views have evolved, but too many people lean into victimhood to make a living. It holds our community back. You didn't grow past it, Jasmine replied. You grew from it. You used your experience as a foundation. But instead of helping others find their footing, you tell them they're imagining the ground beneath them. That landed. The room felt it. Candace shook her head, laughing without humor. You're framing me as a hypocrite because I'm not angry about it anymore? No, Jasmine said. I'm showing people that your story isn't what you claim it is. That you once benefited from a system you now say doesn't exist. Jasmine turned to the audience, to the camera. Racism didn't end because one black woman found success. Pretending it did doesn't help the kids still trying to graduate without being profiled. Or apply for jobs without changing their name. Or survive a traffic stop. Another panelist, a former Arizona senator, tried to pivot. Maybe we focus on solutions. But the spotlight wasn't moving. Candace tried again. You think you're helping people by making them feel like victims? Jasmine didn't raise her voice. No, I'm helping them understand they deserve better. You're helping them forget what it took to get here. You tell them not to complain. But you filed a complaint. And you were right to. Candace opened her mouth. Jasmine leaned in. You said you were harassed. That your school didn't protect you. That you were afraid. That was real. You didn't overcome racism by denying it. You got justice by naming it. The moderator moved to cut to commercial, but his delay said everything. He knew this moment would go viral. Jasmine wasn't finished. She had more to say, and more people ready to listen. Candace had built her brand on control. But control was slipping, not through shouting or spectacle, through stillness, through truth, through a reminder that denial isn't power. It's fear wearing a mask. And Jasmine Crockett had just pulled that mask off. The stage wasn't hers alone, but tonight, the moment was. And in that moment, millions watched not a takedown, but a truth-telling that left no room for retreat. It had begun. Backstage, the energy had shifted into something unspoken but palpable. One producer muttered to another, "She brought the receipts," a phrase that now seemed insufficient to describe what had just unfolded on live television. Candace Owens, once the unshakable presence in any room, now walked with a stiffness in her stride as she exited the stage, her heels clicking against the floor like punctuation marks to a conversation she didn't get to finish. Her assistant hovered behind her, phone in hand, feeding her updates she didn't ask for. You're trending top 5 on X. Over 4 million views on the uncut clip. They're quoting the line about rewriting history. Candace didn't respond, not because she didn't care, but because she hadn't figured out how to reframe what the world had just seen. In the green room, Jasmine Crockett sat calmly, hands folded in her lap, her phone buzzing gently on the table beside her, untouched. She wasn't scrolling for approval, wasn't reacting. She had nothing to prove and even less to explain. Across the country, the segment had become more than television, it was a mirror. People weren't just watching it, they were seeing themselves in it. Teachers, nurses, cashiers, students, pastors, barbers, Everyday people who had carried similar experiences in silence now felt seen. They weren't applauding a soundbite. They were breathing in recognition. On the airwaves, political analysts rushed in with takes. A centrist anchor from Florida said, "I don't care what side you're on, Jasmine Crockett did what we ask our elected officials to do. She showed up prepared, composed, and unafraid to tell the truth." Another tweet, from a policy journalist in D.C., read, "Candace Owens finally met someone who didn't play the game." And it shows. But the story wasn't just playing out in headlines. It was living in comment sections, group chats, kitchen tables. A woman in Detroit wrote, "I've watched Candace for years. That's the first time I've seen her truly rattled." A man in Oakland said, "Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't twist her face. She just put the truth down like a brick, and Candace tripped over it." Across platforms, the quote spread like wildfire. You can't rewrite history just because the cameras are on. It wasn't just memorable, it was irrefutable. Viewers began digging. Screenshots of the 2007 complaint surfaced. Local news stories were unearthed. Archived interviews, court filings, pieces of a truth that had never been buried, only ignored. Not to shame, but to remember. Candace had once asked for protection. Now she was branding that same plea as weakness. And the internet wasn't buying it. That night, Candace issued a statement on social media. "I will never apologize for evolving. Yes, I experienced racism as a teen. I overcame it not by wallowing in it, but by refusing to let it define me." Some people can't stand that kind of strength. But the responses didn't rally like they once did. The pushback was immediate. Evolving doesn't mean erasing. You didn't overcome it by denial. You overcame it by calling it what it was. You can't use your pain to build your platform and then tell others their pain isn't real. Jasmine posted, too, but hers was quiet. A single photo of her in the studio chair, hands calm, gaze forward. 4 words beneath it. Hold your truth steady. No hashtags, no callouts, just presence. And somehow, that said more than any press release. People began sharing it with captions like, "Strength isn't volume," and "This is what grace under pressure looks like." Not because it was flashy, but because it felt like a kind of truth they hadn't seen in too long. A quiet power that didn't need to shout to be heard. Meanwhile, the conversation around Candace's past was no longer avoidable. Even her supporters, those who had once nodded along, were pausing. Not switching sides, but noticing. A mirror had been placed in front of them, and what they saw couldn't be waved away. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about contradiction. One woman wrote on a blog, "I grew up being told to toughen up, that acknowledging racism made me weak." Watching Jasmine say what she did, it felt like someone finally stood up for the 17-year-old me. Another wrote, "Candace taught me to be strong. But Jasmine showed me what strength actually looks like when someone tries to shake you, and you don't flinch." Still, Candace kept posting, kept responding, kept trying to reframe, but the weight of the moment was heavier than her usual spin. She released a podcast that night, called The Whole Exchange, Political Theater, accused the network of setting her up, warned her followers that truth is now dangerous to the left. But even her tone sounded like someone struggling to regain balance. And her audience knew it. The usual fury wasn't there. The volume remained, but the confidence had been cracked. Across the country, in quieter places than studios and Senate floors, the impact lingered. A high school debate coach in Flagstaff played the segment for her students and paused it at the moment Jasmine said, "I'm not trying to make you feel small. I'm trying to remind you you're bigger than this." She looked at her class and asked, "When it's your turn to speak, Which one of these women do you want to be? Not a single student picked volume. In homes, parents replayed the exchange not for drama but for the lesson it carried. In a living room in Columbus, a father paused the clip and told his daughter, "This is how you defend yourself without lowering yourself." In a senior center in Fresno, a retired teacher played the moment for her group and whispered, "She reminded me of how we used to carry ourselves, dignified, even when we were furious." Dignity, that's what kept surfacing in the conversations. Not performance-polished dignity, but real, grounded, deeply rooted dignity, the kind that holds steady in the face of provocation. And Jasmine had done it without raising her voice. She hadn't tried to dominate. She tried to illuminate. She wasn't chasing applause. She was offering clarity. And people noticed. Even some of Candace's past supporters began having private conversations they didn't post about. Not because they'd had a complete change of heart, but because they'd seen something that stayed with them. Something honest, something that didn't fade when the clip ended. And that's how change begins. Not always through thunder. Sometimes, it begins with a single steady voice refusing to move. Jasmine didn't come to perform. She came to stand still in her truth. And by doing that, she moved the room. By morning, the aftershocks were still rippling through the public square. News cycles that usually moved on within hours were still looping the same segment. Major networks reframed the moment, some reluctantly, others with headlines that mirrored what people had already decided in their hearts. Something significant had happened. But beyond the media echo chamber, something quieter, deeper, more enduring was taking root. A shift, not in the balance of power on television, but in the hearts of those who had been told for far too long to downplay their truth. In coffee shops from Philadelphia to Oakland, people were still talking. In group chats and private DMs, screenshots were passed around like artifacts from a battle that didn't rely on swords, but sentences. One woman at a bus stop in Tulsa turned to her coworker and said, she wasn't even mad. That's what made it hit harder. She just stood her ground like she'd done it 100 times before. Because she had. For so many watching, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel like a politician on a stage. She felt like a reflection. Someone who had lived what too many had endured. Being told that what happened didn't really happen, that the scar wasn't really a wound, that the pain was just perception. And she had answered that not with fury but with steadiness. She didn't just correct the record, she restored it. Meanwhile in Washington, colleagues on both sides of the aisle were taking notice. Some called, others sent messages, some public, most private. A neighboring district staffer remarked, Jasmine didn't just win a debate. She reminded us what accountability with grace looks like. That's rare, but it wasn't just rare. It was overdue. So often, political television dissolves into who can talk over whom, who can land the cleverest blow, who can spin discomfort into applause. Jasmine Crockett did none of that. She slowed it down, made the room quiet enough for the truth to echo. And it did, loud enough to cross state lines, class lines, color lines. Loud enough to reach classrooms and courthouses and kitchens. A young woman in San Jose sat in her parked car, recording herself between shifts. Eyes wet, voice steady. I've watched Candace Owens for years. And every time she said people like me were playing the race card, I felt sick. But hearing Jasmine bring up that case, that one thing Candace never talks about, it felt like someone said it plain. We're not crazy. We're not imagining it. And we're not alone. The truth of that landed like a homecoming. Not because Jasmine embarrassed someone, but because she reminded people that their stories didn't need to be edited to be believed. In that moment, she didn't destroy someone. She defended everyone who had never gotten the mic, who had been told to let it go, who had been told their experience was too inconvenient to count. And she did it without spectacle, with facts, with silence, with the kind of pause that speaks louder than any slogan. Teachers who had danced around uncomfortable truths in classrooms now found clarity. One middle school educator in Little Rock wrote in her journal that night, "My students always ask, is racism still real? I used to hesitate. Tomorrow, I'll show them the clip." It wasn't that Jasmine came to prove herself. She didn't need to. She came to stand still, while someone else danced around the truth and stumbled over it. The lesson wasn't about left or right. It wasn't Democrat or Republican. It was about something older than politics. If you live through something painful, and then later deny it to score points, you're not strong. You're pretending, and people can tell the difference. That's what the moment crystallized. Candace Owens had power, platforms, publishers, millions of followers. But what Jasmine had was credibility. And credibility doesn't come from algorithms or applause. It comes from matching your past to your present without pretending the middle part didn't happen. That's why the moment hit hard. Because it wasn't just a takedown. It was a revelation. For once, someone said what needed saying and didn't apologize for it. And that truth, held steady without insult or volume, became its own kind of headline. But the dust had not yet settled. There was still a question lingering in the minds of those watching, one that would shape how both women were remembered in the aftermath. As the noise swirled, and commentary piled up, Candace Owens moved into full reaction mode. She did what she had always done when cornered. She pivoted into control. A podcast dropped that same night. She took to social media with a flurry of posts, framing the incident as ambush, as political theater, as another example of the left using emotion to manipulate reality. What you saw, she told her followers, wasn't truth, it was performance politics. But this time, her words landed differently. Her tone was familiar, but the conviction wasn't. And people noticed. The loyal base remained, but the energy felt quieter, as if even they recognized she hadn't walked away with the win. She was loud, but she wasn't certain. And in that subtle gap, the truth widened. On the other side, Jasmine didn't scramble. She didn't post in all caps. She didn't retweet every compliment or bask in the firestorm. She released no statements, granted no interviews. All she did was post that one photo, those 4 words, "Hold your truth steady." That was it, and somehow, that silence said everything. There was strength in her stillness, a kind of poise that didn't demand attention but commanded respect. People began quoting her again. Not just for the lines she spoke, but for how she carried them. She wasn't trying to dominate the moment, someone wrote. That's why she did, and so the contrast became undeniable. Candace, the voice that had once drowned out opposition with sharp words and sharper comebacks, was now being met with something she couldn't shout down: consistency. The kind that doesn't just exist when the cameras are on. The kind that shows up in the work, in the walk, in the way someone refuses to edit their origin story just because it doesn't fit the brand. That was Jasmine's power, not just in what she said, but in what she didn't need to say. And as the echo of the confrontation stretched beyond the segment, into articles, into classrooms, into quiet conversations that rarely reach the surface, one truth became clear. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to fight. She came to remind. And reminders don't fade. They settle in the soul. What lingered after the moment wasn't noise, it was weight. A quiet, steady recognition that something real had occurred. Something that didn't need background music or graphics to carry meaning. Jasmine Crockett had entered that studio not to argue but to anchor, and people across the country were still processing what it meant. In offices and schools, in lunchrooms and on long commutes, the story played out again and again, not because people needed entertainment, but because they needed clarity. A college student in Madison wrote on her blog, "I used to admire Candace Owens for her confidence. But now I realize that confidence without accountability is just volume. Jasmine showed me what strength looks like when someone tries to rattle you and you don't move." That was the difference. People weren't just reacting anymore. They were reflecting. The clip was being replayed not for shock value but for resonance. It became a touchstone, a moment to pause and say, This is how you hold your ground without shouting. This is what it means to speak with weight, not just words." And the deeper people listened, the more they began to examine their own silences. Not just the big public ones, but the smaller personal ones. The moments they had swallowed pain to keep the peace, to keep the job, to avoid the label of being too much. Jasmine hadn't come with a sword. She had come with memory. And she wielded it with care. Even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't deny the force of her delivery. She wasn't performing. She was remembering, and in doing so, she gave others permission to remember, too. Across the aisle, some political commentators tried to redirect. They framed Jasmine's approach as calculated, rehearsed, theatrical. But that narrative unraveled fast. Too many people had seen the ease in her stillness, the unflinching tone of someone who didn't need to escalate because the truth had already done the work. There was no flurry of insults, no clever deflections. Just receipts, just memory, just one question followed by another until the contradiction stood naked in the light. Meanwhile, the clip kept circulating, not just on political feeds, but on parenting blogs, educator forums, small business chat groups. A therapist in Baltimore shared it with her trauma support group, saying, "Watch how she pauses before speaking. That pause is a boundary. That's a woman who knows the cost of not being believed." And the group nodded, not because they all shared Jasmine's politics, but because they shared the sensation of being erased, then blamed for noticing it. It was no longer about Candace. It was about the people watching, remembering their own high school reports, their own awkward HR meetings, their own moments when they needed someone to take their fear seriously and were met with silence or skepticism. Jasmine didn't name them, but she spoke to them. She didn't claim their stories, but she validated their reality. That was her gift, not to speak for, but to speak beside. And because of that, people listened longer. They leaned in. And when she told the moderator, "We can't talk about justice if we pretend the past didn't happen," it wasn't just a statement. It was a mirror, one that reached backward and forward at once. Candace Owens, for all her rhetorical training, found herself off script. She pivoted to stats, one of her go-to moves, citing FBI data about crime rates among Black Americans. But Jasmine didn't blink. She let the silence sharpen before answering. "Are you really doing that?" she asked, not with outrage, but with gravity. "Throwing out cherry-picked data like it's gospel? You and I both know those numbers don't tell the whole story. Surveillance isn't neutral. Policing isn't neutral. Some crimes never get counted if they happen in a neighborhood with fences and lawyers. Others get processed and punished before a trial is even set. You know that. You've read the same reports I have." Candace tried to interrupt, her voice tightening, accusing Jasmine of justifying violence. But Jasmine leaned back, let the pause linger again, and replied, "No one's justifying anything. I'm saying the system doesn't observe everyone the same way. And you, of all people, should know that. Because you lived it. When you were 17, that was the line that turned the tide. You, of all people." It was an invitation and an indictment all at once. Candace looked for a lifeline. Toward the moderator, toward the camera, but none came. The silence became her opponent. She changed tactics, her voice rising, frustration seeping in. You know what's exhausting? Being told I'm not black enough, or that I'm a traitor just because I don't walk around blaming everything on racism. Jasmine didn't let that pass. No one's calling you a traitor, she said, calm as ever. I'm calling you dishonest. There's a difference. That exchange echoed across timelines like a drumbeat. Honest versus dishonest. Not angry, not radical, just factual. And that distinction made all the difference. Because Jasmine wasn't interested in dismantling Candace. She was interested in dismantling the illusion Candace had built. The illusion that one person's resilience could negate an entire history of harm. That one payout could erase the cost of pain. That denial was the same as healing. And that was a myth Jasmine had come to dismantle, brick by brick, without ever raising her voice. When Candace scoffed and accused Jasmine of selling a narrative, Jasmine didn't snap back. She simply looked forward and replied, "You're the one selling books, podcasts, paid speeches, and that brand you're selling requires people to forget you ever needed help." And there it was, the contradiction held up for all to see, not weaponized, but revealed. Not shouted, but shown. It was the kind of moment you didn't argue with. You just remembered. And Candace did. The camera caught the twitch in her jaw, the tap of her foot, the half-second of silence before her next rebuttal. The moderator tried again to pivot, but Jasmine said, flatly, "Let's finish this point. Because this matters." And she was right. It did. For all the people watching at home. For all the kids being told to ignore the patterns they see. For all the adults who still carry the scars of being gaslit by systems that punished them for speaking up, this mattered. Jasmine looked into the camera then, not to the panel, not to the room, but to the country. If someone's ever made you feel like your experience doesn't count, if they told you it was in your head, don't let them erase you. You matter, even when the people with microphones pretend you don't. That wasn't a line. That was a lifeline, and it was received like one. While viewers caught their breath, Candace was still catching hers. The next few minutes unraveled any remaining control she thought she had. Because Jasmine had one more card to play, the one Candace couldn't walk away from. The truth, the one filed in that complaint, the one buried in interviews and old documents. The one Candace had once fought to be believed, and now wanted everyone else to forget. But Jasmine didn't let her. She just said it, not cruelly, not gleefully, just directly. You were scared. You were young. You were targeted. That was real. It mattered then. It matters now. And pretending it didn't happen? That's not strength. That's survival dressed up as denial. And in that moment, something shifted. Even Candace knew it, because what Jasmine had exposed wasn't just inconsistency. It was something more intimate. The cost of silencing yourself to keep a brand intact. Jasmine wasn't trying to win. She was trying to tell the truth. And the truth, once told, doesn't need applause to be heard. The moderator didn't say anything for a moment. No one did. One of the other panelists reached for a water bottle with the slowest movement imaginable, as though even the sound of plastic crinkling might shatter the tension that wrapped around the room like glass. Candace sat in a strange stillness, her hands tight in her lap, her mouth parted but no words formed. She tried once more to reclaim the moment, her voice pitched higher than before, just a degree off its usual confidence. "I'm not going to sit here and be accused of betraying my community." Jasmine raised her eyebrows ever so slightly and replied, not with fire but with focus, "I didn't accuse you. I reminded you. That's what accountability looks like." It was a correction, not an attack. A mirror held up, not a sword swung. And it landed exactly where it was supposed to. Not in defense, not in argument, but in recognition. Candace let out a quick laugh, more of a reflex than a reaction, and said, "You know, I've sat across from a lot of people trying to make me feel small. You're not the first." Jasmine didn't lean in, didn't even blink. She simply responded, "I'm not trying to make you feel small. I'm trying to remind you that you're bigger than this." And that hit differently, not like a punch, but like a reflection. For just a moment, something flickered in Candace's eyes, something quieter than defeat, something closer to awareness. But Jasmine didn't push. She let the silence do what her voice never needed to. The moderator, finally regaining composure, cleared his throat and spoke softly. "We're going to head to a break shortly, but before we do..." Jasmine cut in gently, her voice rising just enough to claim the closing frame. "Before we do, I want to speak directly to the people watching at home." And then she turned to the camera, not as a performer, not as a politician, but as a witness to something so many had carried in silence. "If you've ever been made to feel like your experience doesn't count," she began, her voice low but full, "if someone told you that you were imagining what they didn't want to deal with, don't let them erase you. Don't let them polish over the truth just because it's hard to look at. You matter, even when the people with microphones pretend you don't." She let that sit, gave it a second to settle in living rooms and bedrooms and office cubicles across the country. And while viewers were catching their breath, Candace was scrambling to catch hers. Because the difference wasn't in how they raised their voices. It was in how one never needed to. When the show cut to commercial, it was already too late to contain it. Raw footage had already been leaked, uncut, unedited. Just Jasmine Crockett, holding her ground, while Candace Owens fumbled in real time. The quote, "You can't rewrite history just because the cameras are on," was already viral, stamped across memes, quoted in captions, shared in group chats, retweeted by names who usually stayed neutral. It was thunder that arrived without a forecast. By the time Jasmine made it back to the green room, the internet was on fire. But she didn't celebrate. Her phone buzzed on the table, but she didn't reach for it. She had said what she came to say, and that was enough. Candace, on the other hand, paced the hallway, her heels too tight, her assistant too close, whispering metrics and numbers that couldn't quite frame what had happened. Her social feeds lit up, but the tone had shifted. Comments were no longer unquestioning. Supporters were now asking. Critics were emboldened. And somewhere in that space between loyalty and doubt, the truth had begun to take root. That evening, Candace released a longer statement. It read, "I will never apologize for evolving. I stand by my story and my beliefs. Strength is moving forward, not wallowing in the past." But it didn't land. Not because it wasn't articulate, but because the weight of what Jasmine had shown couldn't be swept away with phrasing. Thousands pushed back. "Evolving doesn't mean pretending." One comment read, "You didn't wallow. You asked for help. Why pretend now that asking was weakness?" Another read, "You got justice once. Don't slam the door on others trying to do the same." Meanwhile, Jasmine posted nothing more. No tours, no interviews, just that one image, her sitting calmly, hands folded, and the words, "Hold your truth steady." And people did. They shared it, screenshot it, framed it in captions that said, "This is how you speak truth without burning the room down," and "Strength isn't how loud you shout, it's how still you stand when it counts." The contrast between them had never been clearer. Candace had always wielded volume like a weapon. Jasmine had shown what happens when clarity cuts deeper than noise. Even people who had followed Candace for years found themselves asking new questions. Not because they had been converted, but because they had been confronted. Not by rage, but by reason. Not by slogans, but by truth. And the question that began to echo wasn't just about Candace. It was about all the people like her. The mentors, the teachers, the uncles and aunts who once told the truth, but later told others to forget it. Who climbed out of the pit and then told others there was no pit to begin with. Jasmine hadn't shamed Candace. She'd reminded her, and that reminder landed like a truth people had been waiting to hear. One woman wrote in her diary that night, "I've been told for years to move on, that talking about racism made me less employable, less likable. But hearing Jasmine say that the truth doesn't expire, it felt like someone finally had my back." And still Candace kept spinning, posting, recording, releasing clips and quotes and podcasts. But it didn't have the same hold, because the people had already seen something they couldn't unsee. And what Jasmine had offered wasn't spectacle. It was steadiness. A middle school teacher in St. Louis played the clip for her students the next day. She paused it right as Jasmine said, "You didn't grow past it. You grew from it." She looked at her students and said, "This is the kind of strength I want you to remember." And they did, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. Jasmine hadn't just held her own in a televised debate. She'd held something bigger, something people forgot could be held with dignity. She held the truth without turning it into a weapon. She made space for reflection in a space that usually demands performance. And that's why it stuck. That's why it continued to circulate. Not as a scandal, but as a standard. Because what Jasmine did wasn't just political. It was personal. She wasn't defending herself. She was defending the people who never got the mic. Who were told to calm down when they spoke up. Who were told maybe you're imagining it. She stood there as someone who had already heard all those things, and refused to repeat them. And she did it without cruelty, without grandstanding, without waiting for applause. Because courage, real courage, doesn't need confirmation to speak. In the weeks that followed, the energy around the moment didn't fade, it deepened. People rewatched it not to be entertained, but to be reminded. That you don't need to be loud to be powerful. That you don't need to match someone's provocation to dismantle their illusion. That you don't have to be cruel to be clear. Jasmine had shown something simple and unforgettable. You can stand in your truth and not blink. You can meet distortion with composure. And you can say everything that matters, without raising your voice. As the country turned its attention to the next headline, the next outrage, the next debate, Jasmine returned to her work. To hearings, to town halls, to policy. She didn't chase the moment, because the moment had already done its work. It had reminded people that integrity can still live on screen. That dignity still matters. That the truth, when held steady, will always outlast the noise. And that's the legacy Jasmine Crockett left behind. Not a viral clip, not a trending phrase, but a reminder to every person who has ever been told to sit down and forget what they saw. She told them to stand. And they did, quietly, unapologetically, steadily.